Hey, Sub here. Wanted to touch base on a couple of topics that have kind of cropped up since I put up my video last week. So, one of the things that that I talked about was kind of looking at skill distribution in lobbies, and it's been picked up and kind of talked about in a couple of different creators' videos, and there's been just a lot of talk online. And so, one of the things I wanted to do is sit down for a minute and just kind of discuss some of the things surrounding the conversation that this topic invites, and just kind of break down, my findings and my experience trying to have this conversation, and why over the last I don't know, 3 years or so that I've been on Twitter talking about this, I've really altered how I approach this conversation and why I use some of the language that I use, based specifically on findings on these topics. So, number one, let's look at the topic of the paper, of my video, which was what happens if you remove skill based matchmaking from the from public matches of Call of Duty, right? Like if you just take that out of Warzone, what would happen? And what I really found was that it provided a pretty good distribution that didn't, on average, get overwhelmed by the top end players, and that there's kind of room for everybody to do something in that in most lobbies, right? I mean, extremes will exist on either side. Natural chance says eventually you're going to run into a 4KD Warzone World Series of Warzone player, but the reality is most of the time you don't, and it's not going to be a big deal, right? um but on the inverse, what I found is that uh, if you remove a portion of the player base, and I use the example of if they quit, but there's other ways to remove it. It creates a really bad scenario for everybody else, and the lobbies actually become, arguably miserable, and everybody experiences an arguably worse game than they would without skill. And so one of the questions that comes up is, well, Activision did a test and they removed the skill-based matchmaking from their lobbies, and they said everybody hated it. And the reality is that that's not entirely true. I don't want to say that they were dishonest, because nothing that they said is wrong, right? Nothing that they said was a lie, as far as I can tell. But what they did do is they didn't set the parameters correctly. And they told us how they said it, and we all, I think, misinterpreted what they said. Because what they said in their white paper is that they took skill out of the matchmaking equation. They turned that off for a subsection of players to see how that player base worked. And what ultimately we saw when they did this is the matchmaking uh didn't the framework of the matchmaking didn't go away. And the framework of matchmaking that they've described to us actually uses skill in a lot of different subtle ways. For example, input based matchmaking, or device based matchmaking, inherently divides by skill. Unintentionally, maybe, but inherently. Right now, mouse and key players that still play mouse and key, uh, at a straight KD to KD basis, tend to be significantly more skillful at the game than someone of an equal KD who is a controller player, because mouse and key is inherently more difficult in this game than controller is. Okay. So for someone to maintain mouse and key at a certain level, when they switch to controller, they tend to do significantly better than they normally do. And we have hundreds of examples of this. Um, but when you matchmake by input, you are automatically separating out the higher skilled players from the lower skilled players. Okay. Same thing with devices. Console players typically are more will embody a larger portion of lower skilled players that don't play as frequently, players that don't take the game as seriously than someone who would spend $1,000 or more on a dedicated PC to play games. PC players, on average, tend to be more skillful. They tend to play a bit more than console players. So, as an example of how the entirety of the matchmaking system that Call of Duty has thus far described to us, simply removing skill doesn't change the parameters as much, and in fact makes it worse, because now you aren't blending the lobbies properly. You're simply taking the blending that you're doing and you're making some lobbies more difficult than others, instead of properly balancing it, which would be turning off the entire matchmaking system, which they have not said that they did. So while I don't think that what they said is a lie, we have, I think, as a community, misinterpreted much of it and and set the incorrect expectations. Okay, so I don't think I'm not going to say that they lied, but I do think that they set up the equation in such a way that would generate a certain response, and then they told us that it met their expectations, which is fine, except it's not the same as removing the matchmaking system that we currently have, right? That's the conversation that my video is about. If you remove the entire framework, then what happens? So simply saying, oh, we took out skill doesn't do the job. Okay. So point number one. And then that leads to the question of how that negatively affects everybody, right? And when you negatively affect, what I showed is that when you remove a portion of the player base, right? In my case, I took the bottom 20%. You create a significantly worse experience for 80% of players. So you're not actually helping the game overall. You're helping a very small portion of it, 20% in my case. In reality, it's probably somewhat less. It's probably a graduated scale. But you create a worse experience for the majority of the player base. Significantly worse. If you look at the numbers, and I only posted one snapshot, I've looked at this in a number of ways, and the reality is that you as a player will experience an atrociously worse game with a protected bracket of any level, to be honest, than you do with no matchmaking. Okay. And so the reality is, to improve the game for the most number of players, the vast majority of players, 80% plus, you have to remove the skill brackets. Okay. You just have to. And that's why I think other games, will have a non-competitive mode, right? Or a lower competitive mode. In this case, boot camp suits that very well. And I think it's important to keep an eye on, the difference between a protected bracket in the main game and an alternative mode that is more casual friendly, right? That is more that in which stats don't count, in which in which case you could have a visual difference between the two modes, right? Would create a positive environment where people who don't know the game want to learn it, and then people that want to put what they've practiced into place have a place to do that and see positive growth, right? Because right now, when you have a protected bracket, and there's the assumption that, oh, well, we need to protect these players. But the problem is, if those players get better, that's where you have the problem. Wherever that threshold is, as they get better, they eventually move into the unprotected brackets, the unprotected zone of the game, in which case it goes from an enjoyable game to a miserable game because it's miserable for the most number of players. So we're not actually helping the bottom players. We're helping only a few players, a very small percentage of players who never improve. Most people, if they play enough, improve. Okay. So the model shows that the matchmaking system we have is not good, and that protecting any number of players from the main public matches is inherently a negative experience, a net negative across the player base and across the vast majority of players, bar none, right? Nobody experiences an improved scenario outside of the protected brackets. Okay. So that leads to the second problem of who is talking about this? How are we talking about these brackets, right? And there's so many labels that run around. Things like casual, hardcore, midcore, all the cores, okay? So many labels that we throw around. And we talk about people being in these different categories, okay? And I'm guilty of this. When I first came onto Twitter, I believed that there was a separation of styles of play, of ways people are, there's a casual audience and they are um, a vast quiet majority, a silent majority of players. And then there's, the hardcore players who are very good at the game and they only want to feast on the casual players. And I talked about that quite a bit on Twitter. And the reality is that the more I actually talked about it and people started listening, people pushed back on it sometimes pretty heavily. And when they pushed back, I started asking questions such as, well, are you a casual or hardcore player or a midcore player? Whatever that means. And they told me, what the hell are you talking about? I just play the game. Or they'd sit there and say, oh, I'm a super hardcore player. And I'd be like, yeah, but you have like a 0.6 KD. And they go, so what? I play 6 hours a day. I'm just bad at the game. But I live, breathe, and die Call of Duty. I have posters on my wall. And it creates this confusion, right? How do you define these players? And the reality is I asked at least 50 people, both in real life and on Twitter, mostly through DMs. And I took a couple of polls. How do you define yourself? And I looked at their stats and their time played and their attitude to the game. And the reality is there's no such thing as a casual player. There's no such thing as a hardcore player. There's no such thing as a midcore player because those labels can't be defined. You cannot create a categorical definition of a casual player that meets all the criteria of casual players. There are many casual players who are good at the game. They don't play it very often and they don't care. They're just good at it. There are a lot of casual players who are terrible at the game and they don't care either. They just show up when they feel like it, play with their buddies, and log off. There are some hardcore players who play all the time and are bad at the game. There are players who know a credible amount about the game, the lore, the characters. They are invested emotionally and financially into the game, into this franchise, and they are terrible at it. They won't even play multiplayer. They only play cooperative modes because they're bad at it. There are people who only play the story game, and they're very good at playing the story game. They can beat it with their eyes closed on veteran. But they won't call themselves casual. And they don't meet any definition of casual. But they don't play the game the way we play the game. And so the reality is, when it comes to talking about these sorts of things, there are no unified classes. And as such, nobody can speak for these classes, right? There's nobody out there who can speak for the casuals or the hardcores, right? You can't even have someone speak for competitive players because some competitive players, they only play wagers. They play one-on-one versus people. Some people want to qualify for a World Series of Warzone. And some people just want to see their stats improve. They're competitive in that nature. They want to do better than they did yesterday, but they're not playing for money. Okay? There are not classes of people. And people who talk about representing such classes are not correct. They cannot represent classes that don't exist. So we as a player base, especially a more active player base, right? Those of us who work on, play and we interact on social media, we join groups of players, maybe we interact on Reddit or Facebook. We are the player base. And no one speaks for us. We speak for ourselves in this. No one needs to represent us. No one can because we're all different. And trying to break that player base up by these classifications is inherently wrong and divisive. And we should avoid doing it at the end of the day. We do not need to be breaking up the player base into these preconceived notions of who's casual and who's hardcore and who's in the middle and splicing it thinner and thinner and thinner so that somebody can be a voice for them. Because, and I know this because I tried, and it was an utter failure because no one wants that. No one wants to be told how to be. we're going to approach the game the way we want to. And we're going to play how we want. And we're going to enjoy the game the way that we as players want to enjoy it. Okay? Stop turning it into an us versus them. Instead, focus on yourself. Focus on how you enjoy it and the friends you enjoy it with. Try to make new friends, broaden your examples and your experiences, and the game will be more enjoyable to you. Okay? That's what I got for you here. Got any questions? Disagree? Love to hear it. Drop it in the comments down below, and I'll catch you on the next one.